Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Digital Transformation Room. I'm Sam Perrell. I'll be your moderator today, and want to introduce Martha Van Berkel. Martha is the co-founder and CEO of Schema App. It's an end-to-end enterprise solution. She's well known and a thought leader in Schema Markup. She's spoken all around the world, and I'd like to hand it over to Martha.
Awesome. Well, good morning. It's super exciting to be back here in Texas. Someone joked with me, Martha, like, I've seen you in Texas so many times this year. I love coming to share what's going on in the world of Schema Markup. And it is an exciting time right now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this change with SGE and AI search and large language models, what that has to do with schema, and then give you some tactics on how you can approach it, whether you're in SEO, whether you're in content, whether you sort of oversee web architecture. So you can leave here understanding how SEO can be the hero as we go into sort of this AI world. I always introduce myself with a knowledge graph. I'm a total schema nerd. You know this about me, right? So this is my knowledge graph. I am Canadian, so I live just outside Toronto. I am the CEO and co-founder of Schema App. I grew up at Cisco, so I grew up in enterprise, which is part of the reason why we built Schema App the way it is, to sort of introduce agility, to be able to scale, to not have to work with IT, right? Like all the things that are sort of such a struggle sort of when you work in a large organization. And I used to own a 1965 Austin Healey Sprite, and my actual car was in the movie called Losing Chase that Kevin Bacon directed. So you're smiling now because based on the relationships between me, the movie, the car, and Kevin Bacon, you can win the Kevin Bacon game. And the reason this is important is that you have inferred this just like an AI, a large language model, or a search engine does, based on the fact that you understand the relationship between things. And so this is really what Schema Markup does for the content on your site and within your brand. I'll give you some more examples as we go through. So just one moment about who we are. So we are an end-to-end schema markup solution. We basically work with a lot of large organizations as well as mid-sized organizations to help them really think of schema markup in a more strategic way and help them just get it done and get results. So if you're interested to learn more, feel free to come by the booth. I'll be there the next 2 days. So the context is changing. Whether that be through SGE, BARD, as well as with the new Bing, and sort of how search engines are interacting with data. And I think what's interesting is that like these are all driven by knowledge graphs. Large language models are sort of trying to understand things in order to give quick answers, right? To connect the dots, to figure out sort of the Kevin Bacon connection. And if you actually look at sort of what these things work together, these large language models are trying to guess it without sort of understanding relationships. And so this is a really interesting study that talks about how these large language models really work and get grounded with knowledge graphs. And so I'll be using the word knowledge graph and I'll define it for you in just a second, but this is sort of something that we are empowered to do in order to remove all the things that aren't working in large language models, all these hallucinations, all these sort of indecisiveness, or you can think of it as like a control point in order to make sure that it's being understood in the way that you want it to be understood. And this isn't new, right? So like this journey to kind of knowledge graphs and understanding started as far back as 2012 when Google was talking about the difference, the movement of sort of moving from strings to things. And if you really want to get nerdy about entities, Simon's presenting later today. He's going to kind of really define entities, make sure that it's not something that's crazy. Yeah, you got your book on entities. Simon's our expert today. I'll also share with you sort of some other definitions of knowledge graph as we go through. But this isn't new, right? So this has been going on since 2012. Everybody with me on that? And so a knowledge graph, the way I define it, is basically a collection of relationships between things defined in a common vocabulary. Okay, so you saw my example of like defining relationships with Kevin Bacon, right? So we're using Schema Markup to define relationships between things on a page. So whether you're a product company and you're saying, this is the product I offer, and these are all the attributes of that product, and that product is offered by this manufacturer, that's you, right, who you are, or whether you're sort of doing medical work and you're in healthcare and you're trying to describe that this physician works in this medical specialty, but also practices at this hospital and offers these medical services. You're trying to define the relationship between all those elements. And the common vocabulary here is schema.org. So schema.org has been around since 2011. And by the way, it was created by Google, Yahoo, and Bing in order to define all the things that it wanted to know about things, right? And so when you actually define, a knowledge graph, all of a sudden things can be inferenced out of it, right? So this is sort of why the power of schema markup is so big. I was at Brighton SEO this past week, and I was listening to Danny Sullivan, and he was talking about SGE being an experiment that may or may not continue. You love how Google talks that way. But it had me thinking about, I typically talk about, SGE and the new Bing is really sort of the new AI experience. But the fact is that everything search is sort of building on sort of these large language models. It's not just that new interface, that new experiment, but it's also the underlying kind of architecture. And if I like to go back and look as far back as like Rank Brain, right, where we talked about sort of understanding words, right, and concepts, or BERT, where we're sort of like looking at the expression of meaning, or more recently with neural matching, sort of looking at the entire query. And so I like to think of, for me, it was the aha of like, I always think of like, oh, it's just SGE, but really it's like all the elements of search, all the building blocks of search are sort of like looking for these connections. And then again, sort of where a knowledge graph can help them do that. Now, every once in a while, Google makes me smile. So I don't know how many of you watched like the Google search update from John Mueller. So it's a 6-minute video, 4.5 of it is focused on structured data. And what's really interesting is John Mueller, for the very first time, doesn't just say structured data is what you do in order to, achieve a visual change or a rich result in search. Instead, he defined it as the machine readable code that helps search engines understand. This is like a significant change, right? And sort of how he's articulating what structured data is. Supposedly, he also sort of reiterated that at a conference also in Europe. He then said new types will be introduced and go away. So FAQs sort of, died slowly through August and September. By the way, they're back this week, as per an email from my team this morning. We're not sure if this is sort of a core algo change, but we're seeing uptick on FAQs. So if you have FAQs and you didn't take away the structured data, good news. You might be getting some extra clicks and impressions today. And then the last thing he talked about was like, there's going to be continued change. And so you should use a solution that makes it easy to change your structured data. Well, thank you, John Mueller. That's what Schema App does. But this big movement is really sort of lexical search, words to concepts and entities, right? So Simon's presentation this afternoon is going to be key to make sure that you really ground that sort of concept of entities. I like to talk about it in examples, and I'll talk about how sort of the framework is really changing beyond even just entities into knowledge graphs. And so lexical search is where, we used to search with short queries, right? Like I was looking for a doctor, I'd look up his name, to where I'm sort of like doing a longer query. And the example I actually have been using, it's even sort of broader than this, whereas like, what does Dr. Patel specialize in? It's like, I have breast pain and I want to see a Spanish-speaking female doctor who works out of this hospital. Right. So all of a sudden I'm really having to, infer like, well, what medical specialty does breast pain fall under? Does the doctor speak these languages and which hospitals do they practice at? That's a much more complex query. I don't know, you as a consumer, like I ask these really specific questions because I sort of expect them to be able to figure it out. And so entities, in the way I define it, is a thing with specific attributes. And so those of you that do schema markup, this is sort of where you're describing something, right? So whether it be a product, a physician, a location, and then you're using properties to describe it, right? So everything is an entity. And one of the key principles we often talk about is like your web page. So that page that you have on your website should be that primary home for that entity. It should be sort of where you're defining that thing. It's like the container of which you're going to put all your entity information, right? So if you think about a page, like this is the page that you're only talking about this specific product and all the attributes and its relationships to anything else. And as I pontificate as how the web's going to change, I always think about like, well, at what point will we not need a website? And then this then becomes like that container in that house. And so don't be storing like your schema markup or definitions of things off your site. Like it should always be on your site. And so we then switch to think about schema markup being this language to define the entities on your website. right? So it's not just to get rich results, it's instead defining all the things and their relationships. And this is one of my favorite slides. It's really sort of what I see as sort of this evolution of things to strings and going again beyond just entities, because entities aren't enough, right? If I'm just describing me, you're not understanding like how I relate to everything else, right? So when you think of keywords, so keywords is sort of what historically we've looked at, right? That's the string, right? So we're talking about strings to things. How many of you still do keyword research? Yeah, all of us, right? So this is going to change. So when you look at keywords, then you're looking at topic clusters, and I think Semrush just announced, like in a lot of their products, they're like going to try to introduce topic clusters. So we're going to see more sort of conversation around sort of groups of keywords and topics. And then we'll get to entities, right? So like who's talking about this specific thing, right? So an entity can be more than a topic because it can be like related to many topics. But beyond entities, then we want to talk about entities in relationship to things, right? So I want to then, again, I always think of in the business, like it's not just my highlighter product, but it's like my highlighter product that is like, part of the Schema App solution that's like owned by Schema App. And the highlighter like contains all the schema.org vocabulary, right? So you can kind of start thinking about that web, because just like my introduction, like we want to be able to crawl that whole graph, right? We want to be able to go through all those different connections. And so the knowledge graph is one thing to disambiguate it with things like Google's knowledge graph or Wikidata. So I'll show some examples on this. But then ideally, you're also then taking it to the top level to where you're connecting with things offside page, but also totally within your site as well. And when you do this, you're basically providing the whole story as to how all your content's connected, so that when search engines or large language models are consuming it, it really understands that whole picture. Okay, I don't know about you, but I've only had one cup of coffee. Is everyone still with me? Okay, we're good? Okay, so I'm going to show some examples. Any questions thus far? Okay. So this is actually one of our clients' knowledge graphs, right? So we've been able to kind of take their schema markup and look at all the connections. Now you might say, like, Martha, what does the pink and the blue mean? Today, the imagery doesn't actually show differentiation, but you can see all the lines, right? All the ways that they're connected. Now, it's also interesting, these ones on the outside, although it's hard to see on the screen, are actually connected, but only like through one way. And so it's interesting as we dig into those and we're like, well, what pages are those? And what are they talking about? And, are they relevant to other things? And so this is a real switch, right? Where we just thought about schema markup in order to build knowledge or to build rich results, instead of it being sort of this idea that we're using the data on the page to standardize the vocabulary and connect it, and then really define that whole story. And when we do this, that inferencing, that understanding is made much easier, and they're more likely to get it right. Cool, right? Yes, Simon.
What are those individual dots? Are those pages? Are they entities?
They're entities, yeah, which typically are tied to a web page.
Okay. Do you show the web pages there too, or no?
Well, because your entities are primarily you should be defining one primary entity on a page, and then it's like referrals to other pieces. You can assume that the majority of them tie to one exact web page.
So each one of those dots is a unique entity that exists on the site.
That's right.
Okay.
And how it relates to other things. Now, there's cool things we're hoping to do from here, right? Where it's like, okay, well, let's zoom in on the graph and see what's going on. Or if we like layer topics or sort of things that you want to be known about, like how are those things being connected and illustrated on your site? We'll talk about that next year when I come. So the other thing I always like to say is like, well, that's great, Martha, that you believe this, but like, let's ask ChatGPT what it thinks about knowledge graphs. And actually, it's funny because it's like my head of product, who's the semantic architect, who asked this question, because he was like, let's see if they answered the same way I do. So I always like to do this because I like to step back out of the SEO world and say, what else can be of value? So a couple of you work with large enterprise and agencies or sort of national brands. This is sort of where that conversation changes to where like, I'm just not talking about SEO instead. I'm talking about like integration interoperability. So part of this is like, because you have this like one type of data source, other things can question it and consume it now. Semantic search and analysis, so people who use internal search like Solr and so forth, they also need to understand this concept. But you can also use it to, train LLMs and other things. So that third one around machine learning and AI, because you now have this like common vocabulary of structured data, a lot of, I'll say, like the chief data architects at our enterprise clients who are being, asked to build a chatbot sort of in order to help with service, we're now saying, here's a data layer that you have available to you that you can query, that's standardized, that perhaps will accelerate some of the other work that you're doing. So done right, schema markup can add significant value to the organization. And for those of you that are smaller businesses, think of this as like there's going to be all of these other services that are going to be brought out that are kind of going to say, like, give us your data source that you want us to train on or sort of use. So, services, think of like AI, new platforms and services. This will become, your schema markup can become that way that they can train and learn. So it could, I always think about it as like it's a future proofing exercise for an organization. The other thing I want to just talk about, and this is kind of nerdy, so just go with me for a second. So when you're doing your schema markup, like the connection, if we go back to that knowledge graph, like if we're thinking here about, see how like there's dots connecting, the fundamental kind of connecting piece is something in semantic technology that you call a triple. And this is, again, a subject, a predicate, an object, a way that you're sort of connecting the dots. And when you think about schema markup, I don't want you to just think about like, oh, I'm describing this, again, product, and it has, an offer that has a price and then, a piece there. Every time you're adding a property, you're actually giving a triple. So you're explaining something in very specific terms as to what that relationship is. And this is what helps the machines truly understand things. So when you do a property next in schema markup, don't just think of it as, oh, I have to fill this out because it's required and recommended. It's like, this is what I'm using to train the AI. This is like the relationship that's going to help them sort of do that inferencing and understanding. Okay, now that we've talked about all the theoretical stuff, should we get into some examples? Yes, please, Martha. Okay, here we go. So how do we do this? Like, how do we sort of start thinking about this as a strategy within your business and within sort of your work? And so one of the things is very, so we have like 3 steps. So the first is sort of like being really specific about the content that you write. And specific, I mean, is like, it should be able to answer one of those long queries. So instead of it being sort of really top of funnel generic, you need to get more specific about sort of what it is. And so often how I do this on my site is like, if I were to ask a question, if there's 2 pages that I could go to answer the question, they're not specific enough. Does that make sense? So if like you have 2 pages that could be misconstrued as the same thing, they're not specific enough. The second thing then we'll talk about is like, how do we define that entity? So I'll give you an example. And then I want to talk about those like top elements of that entity maturity. So I want to talk about like how you connect it and define it with Wikipedia and Wikidata in context, and then how you also connect it to other things on your site. Good? Let's jump in. Okay. How many of you just do SEO? How many of you work on content? Okay. How many of you also work with your web teams, like on like what the page structure should be? Right. So one of the things that I think as I go through this and as we work with organizations, it's like schema markup isn't just an SEO thing. It is absolutely a team sport, right? Like content teams need to be involved because there's going to be learning about what we want to articulate, what we want on the page. Technical teams are going to be on because we need to make sure like those are sort of in a distinct element that you can understand, especially if you're trying to do things at scale. And so as I go through my recommendations, I'll also highlight sort of which team I think should be involved in those conversations in order to get the best return from it. Okay, so first one, design content about specific topics. So this is like SEO and content. And I've recently visited some of my clients. We work with Advent Health, a big healthcare organization, primarily out of Florida, but they're a national brand now. And it was really fun because we brought the whole cross-functional team together. And I was explaining how when we're describing a physician, like I want to make sure I truly understand all the things about that physician, not their medical specialty, but also like what hospitals, exactly where they practice, all the pieces and how it connects. And then I had the page like web design team on and I was like, oh, and by the way, like I don't want those just in one big paragraph and lump of text because it's not just hard for me to structure it in schema markup, but it's then also harder for search engines, right? It's expensive for search engines in order to kind of explain and understand what that is. And so again, how we think about designing content, how we think about doing it in a scalable way, and then always asking the question of like, how hard is this to be understood? I sort of just described like an element on a page versus a paragraph. Like a paragraph is costly for Google to understand, right? Which is like why we want to do schema markup. So I think we're using our software as an example here. So this is our highlighter page. So let's kind of break down what this looks at. One of the things that I feel like we sometimes forget, we go to Google's documentation to understand what's required and recommended, but we forget that there's many, 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 many more properties within the schema.org vocabulary. And historically, like I would say like in the last 2 years, I primarily would have been like, focus on a rich result, focus on a rich result. I have changed my story in the last 6 months because what I'm seeing is if we can use specificity in order to truly describe what's unique about your product, especially for those of you that are in the manufacturing space. So whether it be stone, metal, lumber, am I getting them right? Like, what is it that makes that specific product really really different or unique? And there's likely a property that allows you to do that. And so I really encourage you, both of SEOs as well as content writers, like go back to the dictionary. It seems so basic, right? Don't use them all. Like, don't take it as a challenge. Like, I'm going to fill out every property, right? But like, does it help articulate what's unique about the page, right? Or about the product? And you'd be surprised. Like and then if it's like 2 things, you can multi-type. I can talk about those different pieces. But I think we've often forgotten that they've given us a lot of the answers of the things that they're trying to answer. With me? All right. So then when you actually know the things that are unique, then you have to ask the question of like, do those things actually exist on the page? Right? And actually go and map them like across, right? So I'm talking about the brand and provider, I'm talking about the category, I'm talking about the name, I have my aggregate rating, I have potential actions, I have positive notes, like whatever those pieces are that you're trying to make sure. So this is often iterative, right? So it's like, oh, what's in the vocabulary? Let's go see if that's on the page today. Oh, it's not on the page. Like, what would be ideal? Okay, let's engage content. Let's engage the web team, right? So this is like, we talk about the schema markup process as being really, truly iterative. And I would say now more than ever, those unique pieces, those things that are distinctive about what the page is about are even more important. And you make it easier for Google to consume if you also put that in the schema markup. Everybody with me? Going back. So if you're doing CMS changes, right? What a perfect time to do this. Like I love when people call me and say that they're going to be kind of changing their CMS and they're like, oh, we'll integrate with it. We'll talk to you afterwards. I'm like, stop. No. Like let's help you define that data model now. Notice I didn't say schema markup strategy. Let's define the data model that we want for these different page types in order for the content to be truly understood. It's a switch, right? We're not just talking about rich results anymore. Okay, so once we do that, I've talked about this for a long time, but like everything should be in context of the page. So I don't love when I see organization markup on every page because what page is talking about the organization and what's the relationship between that page and the organization. So there's lots of properties in order for you to really connect the dots. Whether that be brand, whether that be manufacturer, sort of if you're talking about a product, but all the markup should always be nested. And ideally, you're using an @ ID or a URI in order to say, go to that page in order to learn more about that entity. Yes, Simon.
I think there's 2 schools of thought about having an organization schema on every page versus the home page. To me, it's logical. Organization should be only on the home page, assuming it's multi-location, what have you. Why would you suggest having organization only on the home page? If you go to another page, it might have to figure out, here's my idea of the organization, and then have to go find the organization ID. What's the...
Yeah, so the question is like organization just on the homepage, like why would you sort of make it work? So I agree that organization homepage or corporation or whatever is appropriate should be on the homepage. And that's sort of like if you think of my introduction slide where like I'm in the middle, like I'm saying like what is all of this stuff related to, right? So we need to have, remember, a container, a page that houses that information about the organization. So that's going to be your homepage. On other pages, I then want to understand the relationship, the connection back to that homepage, right? So in this example, I'm talking about my product, right? So I'm talking about our highlighter. I'm being very clear that like the relationship between the highlighter is that it's of the brand, and then go find out more about the brand on the homepage. And so it's, you're basically creating that knowledge graph by creating these connections in context. If you leave anything about here today, I'm being very clear about my relationship to the organization here by using the brand property, right? So you want to give context to the search engines and to the machines to understand the specific relationships versus hoping they'll just figure out the relationship. And it may be like more, I'll say like obvious that again, like, of course, this is of the brand, it's on like schemaapp.com, but some of those are way more nuanced as to like what those relationships are. Is everyone following me on that? Yes, please. Yes.
So the way the products are like laid out, we have a category page and then we have product. We have a product schema across all the product pages. Then we have a category page.
Yep.
Let's say men's running shoes. It has all the men's running shoes, Nike, Adidas,
Mhm.
Vans, and is there anything called collection schema where
Yep.
I can have an array of product schema? Not nested together because there's nothing like a nesting. There's no schema as such, but a category page having array of type schema, and I can just call it as a collection schema. When I read the Google document about this, it says it's not, Google does not recommend a page should have one topic in focus for a schema to be posted on.
Yeah.
Where the category is a mix. Category page is a mix.
Well, a category page is a type of list page, right? So there's also like item list, which is where it's like a more generic type of list. So it would be a category page, and then the category would contain some pieces. I can show you some examples of that if you swing by afterwards, but like it should be a category. Now, I have a hypothesis about category pages. Like, have you seen a lot of traffic to your category pages recently? Yeah. Yeah, so it depends on like how specific your category pages are. I'd say like the general ones, like women's clothing. I don't know about you, but like unless I'm navigating through the site, I typically don't be like, give me a site that talks about women's clothing, right? Like I'm much more specific about that. So over the last couple of years, I've seen sort of traffic move away from category pages and going more to the PDP pages. And so I'd say like my focus would be primarily on making sure those PDP pages are really, really well understood. And then secondarily, look at the category pages. Yeah. So figuring out relationships can be hard. So this is a tool we've had forever. We built it for ourselves. It's called Schema Paths. If you go to www.schemaapp.com, it's in the footer, or if you can just Google Schema Paths, and it basically allows you to figure out how to relate to things. So if I'm asking you to make sure everything's nested and we're defining very clearly the relationship between things, I need to give you tools to be able to figure that out. So here you can see, like, I'm trying to relate a medical clinic to a physician. It'll give me the ways that I can sort of relate that, and you can do the separate, like the opposite as well. And so this is just really handy for you to be able to articulate things. You can pretty much connect anything. I think at one Data Search, I talked about volcanoes and gas stations, and you can like relate a volcano and a gas station. So it's a free tool. It's super easy, but helps you sort of figure out how to do that more advanced schema markup. The last piece I want to do is make sure that you're also disambiguating. So disambiguation is really where you're being specific to say, I'm trying to articulate exactly what this thing is. And I'm going to we typically use Wikidata or Google's Knowledge Graph to do this. If you put 5 things on here, like let's say I'm saying it has category and I'm putting 5 Wikidatas, am I disambiguating? No, right? Like you have to be really specific with disambiguation. You can also do this sort of more broadly, sort of as you do things like, if you want to actually do things like mentions and so forth. So we call this linked entity recognition. Again, this should be in context, right? So you can link entities such as like, what are you mentioning within the article? What is the article about? And you want to be really specific about this. So we just launched our what's called omni-linked entity recognition. So now within our highlighter, you can pick a paragraph, you can identify sort of the key entities out of it, and then map it to a specific property so that you're being very, I'll say, deliberate with regards to sort of how you're disambiguating. And then we're also going to be building sort of what we call entity manager, which will allow brands to actually define the entities that they want, like, and how they want them defined. Because you can imagine if you're doing natural language processing, sometimes it might find things you don't want to disambiguate with. And so we'll be sort of launching that sort of integrate to give sort of the power and control to our companies that we work with in order to make sure that they're defining exactly what they want to disambiguate with. We have seen when we do this well, or like specifically, we are seeing click-through rate increase after deployment. So we've been, we were testing this obviously like in a more manual way since November, and then we just launched in September our at-scale capability of doing this, and we're seeing significant results. I don't have a case study on it yet, but I will soon. So what we're seeing is that the keywords are getting more specific, like, or the queries, like it's matching more specific queries after we do it. So I think it's giving confidence to the search engine or large language model as to sort of what specifically is being spoken about. And as a result, it's rewarding that with more, I'll say, quality clicks. Yeah, and like I said, we'll have a case study out soon. It's just early days. Yes.
One comment.
Oh, Simon, sorry, I'm just going to go to the back of the room first. So yeah, so Fabrice Canal, Bing's been more articulate about how things are working versus Google. So I did spend quite a bit of time with him at PubCon, and he sat through a very similar presentation to this one. And I kind of asked him afterwards, I was like, how'd I do? Like, what'd you think? And he was like, you get it. One of the things he articulated, and I don't know if this exactly answers the question, but I think it's interesting. So in his talk, he was talking about like SEO's not dead. And he said, because there's a data pipeline coming in to, this is Bing, and they're basically pulling in the data pipeline and then they're building services on top of it. And this makes sense, like as a person who builds a software application, right? Like it's way more effective, way more efficient. And he said, like the data that's coming in is what's being indexed. And therefore, like they're using Schema Markup in order to frankly do things cheaper. Like I think we shouldn't, this is very expensive type of computational work, right? Like we do a lot of stuff in our back end. It's super expensive, right? So if this makes it cheaper and easier to be understood, then I'd say absolutely they're using it in order to scale. And Fabrice, I would say, like as much as he can tell me, said basically what I'm talking about is on the money. Simon, you had another question?
Yeah, it's more of a comment on the previous slide.
Sure.
Is a lot of people, they just throw up what about to mention or
Yeah.
that one there. If you look at all listings of all entities, and sometimes it's very easy to say everything on this page is an entity, like everything that shows up as an entity that's selected. But now you're confusing Google about what one being about what that page is about. So
That's
it's
right.
really important to make sure you select the entities that are relevant to the content on the page, not everything.
Yeah. This is an example we wrote, like how to reuse schema markup and knowledge graphs in order for Google and ChatGPT to understand them. So these are the relevant mentions and sort of what it is. It's a very technical article that was written for data architects. But yeah, this isn't entity stuffing, just like keyword stuffing. This is about like being specific based on the content and so where you do it. And I always think of this as like content writers, like that executive summary is going to become really important, right? If you can sort of mention the right important things in there and then sort of, again, pull that into your schema markup to really understand it. Yes? Depends on the content. I think, yeah, I don't think that's a smart idea then. Yeah, I think like there are 800 different descriptions of things in the schema.org vocabulary. Like, be specific. Like, I would say, like, the search engines and the neural matching piece, like, it's getting smart about interpreting your data. So like, I think the years of us like being like, oh, I'm just gonna like say it's this, but it's not that. Like, you have to do the hard work and get that done. And then the last piece is sort of like, you still want to nest your rich results, right? So by virtue of like FAQs back today, when it was like fully dead, gone as of September 13th, like, you know, like they are going to come and go. And so you still want to go after those rich results. We're still seeing significant click-through rate increase for people who are achieving those rich results, especially in the e-commerce product side. So I would say, like, also make sure that those are nested. So again, on your page, there should be like one type of schema markup with all the juicy details underneath. And then this really speaks to sort of like how the metrics are changing. You know, we keep a pretty close eye on how things are performing. We do quarterly business reviews with our clients. Like, we're constantly making sure that we can articulate the return on investment. That's my business, right? Like, I need to make sure I can show the value. So one thing I would say that's really changed, we were just talking about this at our table in the main room, is like, click-through rate is sort of like, you know, is it effectively converting, right? Is it, you know, is the content effective? So click-through rate increases like more qualified traffic. We are seeing, when we do great schema markup, we are seeing click-through rate increase, whether that be with rich result or just overall organic search to those pages. And that is a change. It's something else that, again, Fabrice and I were able to talk about. And I was saying, you know, like, he was saying, like, people are complaining impressions and clicks are going down, but he said quality is going up. The other thing he articulated was the need, like, if you can actually measure conversion, like, through the entire funnel, like, that's going to become more important as SEOs, because it's, again, like, if your clicks have gone down, but you're actually driving more business, good news, right? But what I find is so many clients aren't able to measure that entire conversion funnel. So I think that's going to be I'll say a shift we all need to make, is ensuring that we can actually show that, so that if clicks and impressions are changing because the whole model and the experience is changing, that we can articulate, you know, exactly what that value is of the work that we're doing. The other piece is around agility. So both Google, Gary Illich, and Fabrice have both been talking about, like, the teams who are going to be able to iterate and move quickly, whether that be on content, whether it be on structured data, will be the ones that win. So thinking about how do you introduce agility into your organization. And then finally, like, again, we've been looking at schema markup coverage for the, I'll say, first time. We typically have wanted to make sure that we're optimizing content that gets a rich result. But now that we're seeing sort of increase of traffic and click-through rate when we optimize and disambiguate other content, we're actually looking at, like, are the most important things in the business that are, I'll say, conversion driven, understood, and sort of where is that looking at? And then we'll be actually at Schema App defining sort of how do you measure the health of your knowledge graph. So that's something that we're embarking on over the next couple of quarters, so that you have measures to know sort of like, am I good? Am I actually like focused on those topics? Am I being specific enough about sort of the things that I'm speaking about? So a real evolution of metrics, like, in the last 4 months. Okay, this is like pretty new. So I always like to give ways to learn. I'm on a mission to help make sure people really understand this. So we've been writing a lot about this type of content. And this is not like, what is Schema App? This is like really understanding these concepts. We've been having a lot of our semantic technologists on our team write a lot of these pieces. So if you go to schemaapp.com, it's under resources. It'll also be in the slides. But if you want to learn more about this area of search, just like know that we're just going to keep publishing articles to help you understand. And if there's areas that you want to understand that's not clear, let me know, right? So you, feel free to invite those questions on topics. We've also built school, so like training, it's all free. The first one is really an introduction to schema markup. but semantic schema markup and like why it was written this way. So Jasmine Drudge Wilson, who's one of our product managers, who has worked with semantic technologists like my co-founder for a long time. So she actually has done this training. So again, it's free. It's again on our site, schemaapp.com/training. And then if you want to learn more about our tools, but this is the same place that we'll be publishing all of our new entity and knowledge graph training. So once you're signed up here, you'll get notified when we launch that. And then finally, this is like a broad topic. I've been doing a lot of talks and we've been writing a lot about this. We've actually consolidated that all into an ebook called Entities and Knowledge Graphs for SEO that walks you through sort of how all these connect. So if you have members of your team or you digest things more by reading, this is available for you also for free. Yeah, and then my email's on here. I do like to answer questions and try to connect you with the right content. So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or reach out. That's what I had for you today. What more questions do we have? Yes, please. If it doesn't, then you can just shoot me an email and I will send it to you. I think so. It should be. But as a backup, just ping me. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned that you kind of have an idea of the health of someone's knowledge graph. Do you think the search engines and the AI models are also constructing this kind of score?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's probably going to be, so I think the health of the knowledge graph is one thing. And then I think sort of like how, I'll use the word dense or how relatable you are to a topic is probably the other thing they're doing. So if you've watched Mike King talk about vectoring, or if you like understand sort of how vectors work, a lot of that comes down to sort of knowledge graphs and sort of like how you're related to different topics. So we'll be looking to kind of make that easily digestible for people. Yeah. It's like SEO meets semantic tech. Boom. Yes.
Another reminder for those of us who've been playing with markup that the game isn't over. There's so much more to explore. It's also interesting to see how apps are helping to automate that process, so you don't have to go out and use generators and watch WordPress destroy our markup, and so that you're creating amazing fun.
Thank you. Yeah, like you can't do this well at scale in an automated way. And like, I think for me, what I'm most excited about is just like the other use cases for this. And like we've worked, we have about like 100 enterprise clients, and there's a handful that I would consider like my innovators. And like the innovators are on this, and like we're co-developing with them, like how they're going to be kind of like measuring and thinking about their content. I was like, I need a picture of this. Let's like an overlay of their data layer. And so we're building that with them. So we're just really excited that other teams also in organizations are getting really excited about this. So like as SEOs, we should be really excited, because I have like one of our largest clients, like their entire content team is now like, what are you seeing in the data, right? And then I have like the data architecture AI initiative teams being like, great, like what's in this marketing knowledge graph? And so like this is a pretty big change, right? Like this is a pretty big shift. Like we've been asking people to reuse our knowledge graph for years. Everyone just like looked at me like I was crazy. So like they're asking for it now. They see relevance in it now. And so I really do believe like as SEOs, like if we do this well, like we can be the hero in this, like, you know, like what are you doing to help our organization be ready for what's coming next? By the way, like schema markup is sort of part of that answer. Like it's kind of unbelievable, but if you think of it outside of rich results and you think of it as this marketing data layer, it's like absolutely true. And I think the coolest part for the smaller organizations here is that like you're going to be hugely differentiated if you can figure this out, because I'm telling you, like a lot of your peers aren't sitting at Data Search and aren't asking these questions, right? So congratulations, right? Like you're taking that first step. And I'm like, I want to be a resource. So I'm here like the next 2 days. Ask me all your questions, like bring up your website. We'll have a look. I'm happy to help.